And I couldn't get this poem out of my mind because it's a little confusing at first. I talked with a friend yesterday about it. He said, what does that mean? And he didn't, so we talked about it yesterday. It encapsulates a lot of the things that we have talked about in terms of what's meaningful and what's useful in life and where real value lies and where we put our allegiance and that sort of thing. And so I figure we go over the poem line by line and then do a long mindfulness meditation and then do a fairly long compassion exercise. Because ultimately, to me, that's what all this is for, is to deepen our practice and to continue to increase our ability to feel and generate compassion. So the first line says, there is this and there is that. I've mentioned a couple times, and sort of one of my sub-hobbies, things I'm really interested in, is when people refer to God, what that word is and what it means to them. The different cultures. In Judaism, I think it's 16. They have the 69 names of God, or whatever it is, and in Islam, it's the 99 names of God, and each one is a different attribute of God. But I thought in the Jewish tradition, where does that come from? And in the Old Testament, Moses is on the mount, and he wants to know. He asks God who He is. Who are you? What is, what's going on here? And finally, after asking three, God said, I am that I am. Fairly well-known passage. But I thought about it, that's sort of odd. What does He mean by that? Does He mean that's just I am, I'm just being? Or, so the way I interpret that is I am that. In other words, everything that you can think of is this. And everything else is that. And that's who I am. I don't know if anybody's read the Carlos Castaneda books. Really fascinating. It's about a grad student who went down to Mexico to study the culture down there, and he ran into this brujo, they call in Mexico, who became this guy's teacher. Taught him all the kind of secret stuff of the Nahuatl, and it's an incredible book, a set of books. And there's some discussion about whether or not Castaneda was actually real. Well, I happened to run into somebody a little while ago, a year or two ago, who actually knew Castaneda. So he said, yes, Castaneda is real. So if you ever read the Castaneda books, he's the real person, and those are his writings. But anyway, he's sitting with his teacher at a diner in the morning having breakfast, and his teacher's trying to communicate to him the nature of reality. And Castaneda says this, he says, no, it's not that, and his teacher wipes everything off the table and says, that's what it is. In other words, everything you can think of, conceive of, have known, might know, all that is just stuff up here. The real reality is beneath all of that. And so, and then also in Alcoholics Anonymous, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about when somebody really gets in contact with a higher power and really gets their life together and is working the program. So basically all sorts of remarkable things happen, quote unquote. But one of the things happened, they say, and I thought that was pretty lofty when I read it, you rocketed into the fourth dimension, which I think is really kind of new agey, right? But it's really true. In Alcoholics Anonymous, some of the people I've met and know in long-term sobriety and stuff, they live a completely different life than a lot of people. But it's also based on this idea that we have no idea what God is. Just don't know. Story I've told before, I was a part of a group of teachers and grad students and therapists who would meet once a month at SMU, and they would bring in somebody who was really had some really interesting stuff to talk about, and we'd discuss it. Well, one time this guy came in, and I don't remember his name, but he's a PhD student. He was Native American, and he was talking about Native American spirituality. You know, he'd say, but to us, the rocks are alive, and the trees are alive, and the earth is alive. And then he'd go on and talk about how everything came from the Creator. And so I said to him, I asked him a question. I said, you know, and forgive me, those who've already heard this, but I'm really grateful for him for this, being able to ask this guy this question. So I said, when you're talking about the Creator, you're talking about sometimes it sounds polytheistic, you know, the trees and the rocks and stuff. And then sometimes you're talking about the Creator and it sounds monotheistic. Would you care to comment? And he said, well, we don't know. He said, it's a mystery. And he just left it at that. The idea of the contemplative traditions is that we're living in a mystery. So forget about trying to understand it. Everything that you know, it's not that. And all the traditions have some means or some way or some path to overcome this tendency that we have to think of thoughts as reality. You know, I've talked about Marcel Duchamp's painting about a pipe and you know, tobacco pipe, and underneath the pipe it says, in translated in English, this is not a pipe. You know, really flip people out. You know, what is this? This is a pipe. You know, we tend to make up realities in our mind that just are really thoughts in our mind, no more nor less. They're conceptualizations or a hologram. It's like if we think of one of our least favorite people, and usually everybody has at least one least favorite person, and we think about them, we start getting all riled up. And we think about this, and they did this, and they did that, and I thought, but what's the reality? The reality is that that's all in my mind. You know, it's like people who weren't treated well by their parents and really have some things to work through there. And the parents, and then the parent has been dead 10 years. They keep talking about their mom this or their dad that. And I said, wait a minute, they're not even here. What are you talking about? Well, they did. Well, I said, well, look, they're no longer here, meaning that whatever's going on for you about that is in your own mind. And then they begin to catch on the fact that their conceptualization of those events and their parent and what happened, that's stuck in their mind. And that's what the problem is. And they have, since it's that way, they have the power, the ability to resolve that. I often use the example of the first time Jaws, the movie Jaws was shown. Spielberg thought they had a hit. And so he and the producer were standing in the back of the movie theater trying to watch what the audience reaction. And in the beginning, the moment of the shark attack, everybody in the theater jumped. And so when I present this to people, I say, okay, where was the shark? And they go, well, in the water. I said, well, then where was the water? You know, and then I go on and say, like, look, we have our favorite sharks, okay? Whether it's a political candidate or it's the ousted president of Syria or whoever it is, we have our favorite sharks. And we react to them over and over and over and over and over again, thinking it's them, but it's not them. They're just a concept in our own mind. And so, in the contemplative traditions, they talk about the nature of reality to some degree. And the reality can only be perceived, not constructed, can be alluded to. You know, in Zen they talk about a finger pointing at the moon. You know, and or seeing moon in a reflection in the water. And it's that reflection in the water that's what we see. And we don't even look at the moon. There's this idea comes in many different forms from many different traditions. And so when we're dealing with, when we're talking about meditation, to me, one of my favorite questions is, and I would ask everybody to close their eyes, and I said, what do you see? Well, it's kind of dark in there. I mean, and then ideas start popping in. Well, what if no ideas popped in? What's there? What do you see? So we begin to get the idea that the internal environment, the interiority that we carry with us is very different than the material world. The material world is constructed, and it's conceptualized. And we think of good and bad, hot and cold, and that and there's time, there's a yesterday and a tomorrow and all that, but not all of that really applies all that well when we're in meditation and we're talking about the wisdom traditions. That's the first line, so it sets it up that there is this and there is that. And saying, this we know a lot about. We know a lot about this. We've got experts, we've got historians, we've got scientists, we've got Netflix, we've got all this information about so-called life or reality or the world or whatever that is all about this. It's really not about what underlies it and what the traditions are talking about. So the first, when we're attempting to become more conscious or more awake, however you want to couch it, whatever that means to you, is that it's important to make the distinction between our external world and our internal world. First heard the word interiority from Father Thomas Keating, and he talks about meditation helps us develop a sense of interiority, so we become familiar with that so-called inner world. There is this and there is that. We know a lot about this, but not much about that. That's why we have meditation, and that's what the contemplatives are going for, is that. We think this is all that is. In other words, we even have a conception of God and spiritual principles as material. We think we can catch light in a box. When we talk about it, and think we've got it. And that is simply an experience. There's nothing that can be conceptualized. Because we think that is this, in other words, that this world, that there's happiness in it, or something eternal in this world, there's something that'll bring us peace of mind, that sort of thing. And we pursue that, and we pursue aspects of the material life for internal satisfaction. We talk a lot about, which is exactly what addictions are, or people who look at achievement to bring them some sort of happiness. So we pursue this as if it were that, thinking that the job or the person getting married or making a bunch of money or being CEO of some company or whatever it is, or writing some famous novel or whatever it is going to bring this personal satisfaction from our deepest interior, and it doesn't happen. So it says, as if we pursue this as if it were that, and when terribly disappointed, because we will at some point become disillusioned. That's kind of a problem, because when we're disillusioned, we only have two options. One, to keep on trying. If we made $10 million, we'll go, wow, that's awesome. Now I'm going to turn that into $100 million. Or we go, no, this isn't going to do it ever, so I need to do something else. And then people start on some sort of spiritual kind of path. And when terribly disappointed, we look harder at that in this again. So we're looking for eternal stuff in temporal stuff. And it just doesn't work out. And then the last few lines is, yet we may realize that this isn't that, but that is this. But that is this, and that's that. In other words, everything is actually of a spiritual nature. We just don't see it because we're categorizing things and making up stories about good and bad and ancient and contemporary and time flow and principles and all this stuff, and we think that the material world, but what we find is where it's at. So where that is, worship of sacred objects. It's like, that's great, but it's not really that, because that is simply an experience, and that is the last line, meaning that's really all we have, but we don't know it. And so that's been the message of all the contemplative traditions, and ultimately what meditation can help us to understand, apprehend, experience. And it's one of the things that I run into a lot, talk about meditation, and somebody say, oh yeah, I meditate. No. The idea, because it's been commoditized, is that we want greater well-being, or 10% more happy, or feel better, or be a better person, or whatever be cool, or whatever the objective is. But ultimately, it begins to introduce us to this whole concept of being able to sort out the real from the unreal, and the delusional from the actual. Because when we let go of a thought, what we're doing is we're saying, oh, it's not this. I'm interested in that. Well, what's that? I don't know. Certitude really becomes a problem. I think I know this, and I know that, and I know this, and I know this. Like, no, we don't really know. Mindfulness, in the very act of mindfulness, when a thought comes up, or we bring our awareness to what's going on in our mind, we've taken a step back from the habitual framework of the world, and we go, oh, okay, let's let that go, and I'll come back to the present moment. And then somehow in the present moment, the more we were able to be there in the present moment, we begin to realize that, the present moment is just kind of mysterious. It doesn't seem to have time. There's no clock ticking. And past, present, and future seem to be kind of merged together sometimes. We'll remember stuff that we haven't remembered, and when we were 3 years old, and it begins to help us sort out this from that, and to realize that there is a this and a that. And every religion has talked about, and I've mentioned this before, every religion talks about that the things of this world will not provide the kind of happiness, satisfaction, contentment, awakening, whatever it is we think is important, cannot provide it. No matter how many. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh had 14 Mercedes-Benz before everything fell apart. It's like, why 14? Why get 4? I mean, why even buy one? I mean, who cares? Yeah, that was a problem before everything fell apart, the community and all. So we're left with, okay, what really is meaningful? What really is worth pursuing and developing? What comes about is this sense of orientation toward contentment. And when we think about that and sort of leave the word happiness off a little bit, we're not thinking about that so much, and thinking about what contentment really is, about peace of mind, where everything's settled and everything's okay, regardless of whether somebody is hanging off your bumper a foot or two, whatever. And the way the world goes, and this is really one of the reasons this whole thing started years ago, this Sunday session, was that it's about how do we deal with the intensity of what's going on around us. I mean, there's so much going on, and there's so much nonsense going on, there's so much deception going on, there's so much cruelty going on. How can we possibly survive and maintain our dignity and our humanity given what's going on in the world today? And the answer is this interior world. When somebody has this interior world, that the rest doesn't really matter that much. It's important, we don't ignore it, but it doesn't overwhelm us. One of the great challenges for me personally was a sense of outrage at the injustices that are going on. But I had to take a look down that road. What's down that road? More and more frustration, unless I want to go back to school and become a lawyer, and take up some of these issues, go into medicine or whatever, to actually take some part in undoing some of these injustices that are going on. Well, two things happen. One, I become outraged and incensed, and that's not good for my well-being. And the other is, I realize there's a lot of people out there that's their job. In one way, my job is to do the best I can in helping myself and others kind of see what's going on and what is most valuable in life, where the real value in life lies, so that whatever happens, and this may sound really corny, whatever happens is just what happens. When stuff happens, we just deal with what happens. And that comes from an inner stability that's unshakable. One last story. There's a Tibetan teacher, Jamgon Kongtrul, and he was riding with several other monks in a car. This is 9-10 years ago, and there was a car accident and he was killed. And it was really a shock. But I read some accounts of one of the people came on the scene and came across his body. He was killed immediately. He was thrown from the car. But he had a smile on his face. I thought that was really pretty interesting. And one story, the Karmapa, the Dalai Lama reincarnates. This is the 14th Dalai Lama. And there's also a fellow by the name of the Karmapa who came later, but he figured out how to reincarnate and stuff. And he says now it's the 17th Karmapa. So in the 16th Karmapa he was dying. He was in the process of dying. He's going to die soon. One of his students was broken down in tears and so upset and said, Rinpoche, you're going to be leaving us. And the Karmapa leaned over and whispered in his ear, nothing happens. So I just thought that was an interesting Now, I'm not there, okay? Just to say, these are ideals, and I relate these stories because for me, what they did was they helped to broaden my conceptual framework of what's possible, whether I can even believe it or not. But it's really important. It was really important for me to begin to look outside the mundane conceptual framework of what is and is not, and what's valuable and what's not valuable, what we're doing here on the planet, etc. And so a lot of these things, I don't know, but they're consistent. I take a look at different traditions and different things in different traditions. They're really consistent. So I'm content with a maybe. I have a fat maybe. I don't know. But I do know that the path is valid. Because the people who talk about that stuff, each one has their own particular path. But that's what they talk about. So we have a path. The entry point is with mindfulness, and the practice is compassion. So wisdom and compassion is the basic nature of any valid spiritual tradition, in my opinion. And so I wanted to talk about mindfulness in particular for its implications that we don't usually discuss. We just talk about it as a way to settle down and begin to recognize thoughts and begin to access that wordless space, that interior space. When we do that over and over and over again and really practice that, and then we begin working with a particular tradition, whatever that may be, we get to see the far-reaching implications. And so sometimes it's important to have, whether we even believe it or not, a larger conceptual framework. It's easier to do the practices because we know that we don't know. And it helps to reduce the striving, which is I'm going to achieve, consciously or unconsciously, I'm going to achieve this, I want to achieve that. And the reality is like, I don't know. And that's why working with a tradition is so important, whatever that may be. With the Native American tradition, or Buddhism, or Hinduism, or Islam, the Sufis, whatever it is, or the contemplative traditions in the Abrahamic religions. When I first thought about doing this with the poem, I thought, nah, it's not really. But then I started thinking about it, and our conceptual framework is really important. And if we're unaware of what our conceptual framework is, that makes life really difficult, because we're not really sure of what we're doing. We have this conceptual framework, and that's what we work within. It's like a laboratory that never changes, right? So the task is, in doing these exercises, doing these practices, is to become aware that there is a greater conceptual framework than what we could possibly imagine, and that's okay. But just to know that sometimes can be very helpful and help us to just practice. I say periodically that the most important thing about practice is just practice. That's it. And whatever goes on in practice, that's fine. You just keep practicing. With that in mind, time to practice. And also, if you all can, either in the talk today or email me some thoughts about this whole topic today, I'd be interested in what you have to say or what you think about it. Okay, so finding a comfortable spot, comfortable place. And so the body doesn't have to move at all to remain comfortable. And we'll begin. And settling into silence like the bell, following the sound into stillness. And noticing the stillness of the body and the points of contact with the chair or the floor, whatever it may be. And just settling with ease into the present moment as best you can, into the body, which is our home base in time and space. And allowing the mind to just simply be as it is. And each time a thought or feeling comes up, simply recognizing it and releasing it, and returning to the present moment as best you can. And each time something arises, it's okay. That's kind of what happens. The brain does what it does without our permission. Sends up thoughts and feelings, or an itching earlobe, or whatever it may be. And we just notice and release and return. And as we do this, we settle further into the body, and the body settles further into the present moment. And just allowing ourselves to continue in the process of just sitting as best we can. And allowing ourselves and our mind and our body just to be as it is. And just sitting in the steadiness of sitting. Like a small stone floating to the bottom of a lake. And perhaps seeing this internal space as space. And bringing to mind the places in our own being that need compassion from things that we have done to others, others have done to us, or the way we have done to ourselves. And with a sense of forgiveness and warmth and acceptance, allowing that compassion to flow in whatever form seems right. Allowing oneself to be compassionate toward every aspect of your own being, eliminating right and wrong. That has no bearing here. And allowing oneself to fill up, so to speak, with this compassion. Flooding every aspect of your being, even the tiniest spaces. Filling us up to the point, being filled completely. To the limit, every aspect of our being. Fullness flowing over. And bringing to mind a loved one, past, present, or future. And this overflow of compassion, sending it to them. And sensing them absorbing it and allowing it in. And it seems that the more we send, the more we receive, and the more we share. And now also bringing to mind a neutral person, somebody you may know their name, but not much of a relationship. And sending this compassion to them as well, from your overflow. And sensing they're absorbing it. And it filtering in and through their whole system like it has ours. And they may never know it was you sending this compassion that made a difference in their day. And now extending this compassion to a difficult person, put on a scale of 1 to 10, no more than a 3, because this is can be difficult to do for some folks. But someone who find irritating or difficult, and sending them the compassion anyway, knowing perhaps that that's what they've needed all along and didn't know it. But without any, in an unconditional manner, sending them compassion as well. And allowing the compassion to do its work, regardless of what we may think about this person or our history with them. Whether or not they're able to absorb it. and extending beyond, if possible. The more difficult conceptualization is all beings, regardless of being good or bad, or criminals or kings or queens. Those already with compassion are all those who are bereft of compassion and need it the most. Allowing ourselves to extend the fullness of compassion unconditionally. And now continuing to extend to Mother Earth herself, who's been through a lot at the hands of human beings. And perhaps getting a notion that compassion can be the eternal equalizer. Some will be more open to it than others, but nevertheless they deserve compassion. And now allowing all the visualizations to dissolve back into the field of mindfulness, of equanimity, of just being. And allowing ourselves to absorb the entire experience as best we can, letting it sink into the body like water being absorbed by a sponge. Whether we understand it or not, or like it or not, just allowing ourselves to absorb the entire experience. So that in a moment when the bell rings again, you can bring this with you as you go about your day and come back to it at any time.